Well, good morning from my end, and thanks for the invitation. I think Gloria and Tucker have done a nice job in mixing academics and practitioners. So I will also, as my predecessor, take a somewhat historical perspective and then leave the details to the industry experts, Scott and Mark. So before I begin, let me point out that this is work that Tucker and I have been doing for a couple of months now, and we're making an outrageous claim here. So the argument is that throughout human history, there have been two archetypes, we label them eras, of how product development worked. And we're about to enter a third. That's sort of in a nutshell what I'm going to talk about. To give you some example of how we are thinking about this, let me run you through the history of writing over the last 1,200 years or so. And I have to say, most of my data is from Europe, so I apologize for other parts of the world that might have developed writing and reading independently. But in Europe, for about 800 years, the number of publications was highly correlated with the number of monasteries that existed, right? Because these were the only people who did either or both of them, writing books and reading them. That changed, obviously, with a technical invention, the printing press in 1454. And I have some data here to illustrate this. You can see that on the left-hand side. Notice that the two graphs have very different scales. And the difference between them is, in fact, the invention of the printing press. Plus, so here's a logarithmic scale that shows the development over the 1,200 years. What happened next was that the distribution channels changed, right? Newspapers were invented around 16th century, and broader use, if you will, of the reading and writing happened. In the 19th century, the typewriter was invented, which not only introduced an entirely new profession, it also increased the quality dramatically, and by extension, lowered the unit cost, so and led to a broader availability as well. 80 years later, we saw the same effect through the computers. The typist, this profession actually went away. So most of you today actually write your own letters. And the last two we saw with the advent of the internet that today some documents aren't even printed anymore. They are just existing in digital forms. And the last point here is that it also now has affected of how it's distributed. Right? People can self-publish work that wasn't 20 years ago possible with the same amount of labor, if you will. So take this brief history, and what I want to extract from this is basically that 6 variables are very helpful in viewing how it's changed over time. So on the process description side, we want to look at task allocation, which means who does actually the work. The locus of expertise, and here the difference is really whether it's in a person or in a tool. And the ownership, who actually controls the access to it. And then we use 3 outcome variables: unit cost, quality, broadly construed, and variety, to see how what the effect is. All right, so now I want to take you through a whirlwind tour of 500 years of product development. With that framework, right? So we're looking at task allocation, that's on the left-hand side, and we distinguish basically conceiving and developing a product, making it, and using it as 3 functions. And then we distinguish the actors, is it the user, a person itself, or an expert company, and we look at the locus of expertise. So where is it? Does it reside in a person or in a tool? So let's start our journey. For very few people, life looked like this 500 years ago, right? So on the upper right is the Cathedral of Canterbury, and on the lower left, supposedly a room in the Tower of London. So these people obviously didn't make a lot of stuff for themselves, right? The kings and dukes. They had people who did that for them. So we could label that the designing and making was done by a small cadre of craftspeople, and then the kings and dukes were the users. For the vast majority of the people, however, it looked like this, right? So it was hard labor, very simple dwellings. You typically lived with your cows if you owned anything together, and other animals. And anything you owned was very functional. And chances were you had made it yourself, right? So you were the person who perceived the need for a new table, figured out the design, made it, and used it. So in some sense, in our little sketch here, it was all within one person, all these activities. And so we had a low number of the low volume, because people's work was obviously constrained by their skills and resources, chances are the quality was fairly low because they had to learn everything themselves. But the variety was very high, right? Everybody made the table the way he or she wanted, given the constraints. Now, that changed, obviously, with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, right? Work changed, became very different. The output increased dramatically, and the unit cost fell dramatically, which led to situations that now many workers were paid better and their own living standard rose. So on the left hand, these are images that Ford Motor Company actually has in its archive. And it's interesting that in the 1910s and 20s, Henry Ford himself was interested in the betterment of his employees. So these texts are not mine, but his, or his company's, put it this way. That's why he talks about undesirable home surroundings. But the more important fact for us is now there were many, many people who became consumers, who had the time, the weekend, and the means to purchase more products. So as a result, we see a split between designers and makers who became experts, a car company, for instance, and a user. Over time, we perfected that system and became far more productive and actually reintroduced some variety. Initially, you saw that picture of the Ford Motor Company axles. They were all the same. I think Amy quoted Henry Ford already this morning. Another famous quote from him was, well, you can have any color as long as it's black, right? So coming back to the issue of that drives down unit cost, and everybody can have one. So what we see is, we've seen over the last 50 years is that the supply chains have been split even further. So more specialized companies now are active in designing and producing and making certain parts. And the user is further removed from that, right? So which introduced the need for new functions like marketing to get the information from the user and its needs back to the company who actually makes stuff. The other point I want to make here on this lower right corner, the reason why I now put a tool symbol into the user is that a lot of the expertise to use, operate a product, is already moving into the product. So think about 100 years ago, if you were to buy a car, you better knew how to maintain that, right? Today, all of us drive cars, use devices, and we have really no idea what they do, what the underlying physics is, and why they work the way they do. Right, so a lot of the expertise actually required is now provided by the tool itself. And I mentioned already, so the variety went up a little bit with the advent of more customizable production technologies. Volume and quality increased further. So now the argument that we're making is that we're entering a third era. And we can see that with dramatic increase of variety and the involvement of users, sort of the reintroduction of the user in these processes. So for example, you can now become your own winemaker if you think that the blend that you can come up with, you might even name it after, I don't know, your dog or so, is what you want and that it's better than some expert could create. So the argument is that the user is sort of coming back into the picture, but different from the first era now, with a much stronger support of technology. And that's, in fact, the link to the IT discussion this morning. And I want to show you a couple of examples that sort of our thinking is as illustrations. It's not an argument for good or bad management, but sort of as illustration of what is happening to the innovation processes and what different forms are emerging. And we think the difference to the first one, obviously, is that volume and quality are maintained, but the variety comes back through the bigger user introduction. And it's helpful for that to think through what drives these era shifts, right? I will very quickly be on this one because legions of historians and economists have talked about how our world has changed as a consequence of the Industrial Revolution. But we think what's happening now is driven by two technical developments, three if you include broadly the internet, and a cultural one. So the first one is that in the design space, and you will hear more details, I'm sure, about the latest thinking from the experts, but what you can see is that the technology, 3D CAD systems, have become enormously powerful and enormously user-friendly, which suggests that more and more people with less and less training can actually get engaged into the process of conceiving and designing products. The same thing is now happening with rapid prototyping technologies. 3D printing is the often used term in the general press, but there's a whole range of processes that actually lowers the unit cost, if you will, by no longer having dedicated tooling, and therefore allowing a much broader share of the population to engage in actually manufacturing things. And the third one is, and Amy talked at length about this morning, that the generation of millennials who grew up with Facebook, et cetera, have a very different way of sharing, collaborating, and that now comes back to the companies. And we also think that these three forces reinforce each other, right? So for example, if I already have a digital design model, I can translate it into an STL file that a rapid prototyping machine can read, and it's done, right? Vice versa, the prototyping machine allows me now to design things that I couldn't make with traditional manufacturing processes. And so now I can have the wildest idea much easier translated into real products. So before I close, as I promised, I wanted to show you 4 different models, if you will, that we see currently emerging as innovation processes or more narrowly defined product development processes. And we're sort of trying to come up with a framework to describe these 4, and here's our current version of that. The one dimension we're using to distinguish is sort of simple and complex products, and the other one, here labeled firm and community, is really more around the level of control, right? So if you think about a firm has suppliers, but it makes sort of very dedicated decisions. Who is my partner and how do I collaborate with them? And sort of what I labeled here community is far more open, right? So in the direction of crowdsourcing and different ways of engaging much larger communities. So the 4 examples I want to show you, and I start on the lower right, labeled Boeing, because that's the one that researchers like us have been studying for the last 20 years. And we think it's not going to go away, but it will change and benefit from these IT developments as well as cultural changes. So many of you probably have over the years heard many different things and read press releases of 787 and all the things that went wrong. The latest one, the battery, but also the 4-year delay in the delivery of the first airplane. But if you think about it, it was an enormous challenge, right? New technology, and for political and financial reason, a very distributed supply chain, right? So this issue of collaboration was actually very, very challenging. Add to this the question of how much you actually allow your employees to share with the suppliers, because you're worried that the suppliers will become your competitors in the next generation, right? So that's a very big issue, and not only that Boeing, Airbus goes through the same thing, and in all large development projects, it's not just the technology, it's also the underlying issue of how do you organize the work and how do you separate rights, and so the IP question is a very important piece. But in a sense, it's sort of a process we've seen before. The second one, we labeled as makerspace, which is sort of just a collective name for all kinds of communities that form and build local production facility, if you will. And the one I picked here is over in Somerville, which is basically a huge workshop where you can rent space, time, access to machines, right? But what this does is, including 3D printing and laser cutters and all these sort of more recently in the discussion, the technologies. But what it does is allow individuals and very small scale companies getting into the business of designing and making parts. So in other words, the entry barriers are much lower now. And we think that form a continuous reconfiguration of your own, who's your business and who are your suppliers, will emerge as one form. The third one I want to mention, and that now takes a much bigger step into the direction of introducing social media and social collaboration, is a company called Quirky. It's in New York. And their whole business model is to maintain a community. I think at recent count it's 400,000 people. And as this process diagram shows, their role is not only to feed the idea generation process at the beginning, but also get engaged at multiple points throughout the product development process, in evaluation tasks, in consulting tasks, and a whole host of variety of activities. And Quirky has come up with an algorithm that attributes influence points that then at some point are translated into monetary gains. Now it's very skewed, so the vast majority of these 400,000 people will not be able to live off that. But it seems to be enough to maintain the community, although until this point, right? The company is now at 4 years old. So we'll see where that leads to and whether there's enough space for multiple companies of that type. But certainly a new model to get broader shares of the population involved into making and designing products. And then the last one is sort of on the community and complex end, even in our government. So this is a project by DARPA. FANG stands for Fast Adaptable Next Generation Ground Vehicles. So think about an amphibious personnel carrier for soldiers. And so their idea was to broadcast and search certain subtasks. And in fact, just 3 weeks ago, they awarded $1 million as a prize for a team that solved a sub-problem around the propulsion system. All right. So again, a way of developing technology with involving much larger groups of people. And I want to leave you with some questions, and that hopefully creates a transition to the more IT-focused discussion, that we think in the innovation processes now have to be rethought on a more fundamental level, right? So rethinking employee and user relationship, who does actually what? That leads to how do you incentivize both parties, the people inside your company as well as outside, and also who gains the benefits, right? From the company's perspective, that then also means who do I partner with in narrow terms, like in a traditional supply chain, or with larger groups outside? Where do I expect the innovation to come from? So someone earlier had this question, how do I engage large number of users, and then how do I sort them out? Well, maybe the user community does that as well. And so there are models, so Threadless, where users actually score ideas and take at least care of the first round of that selection. And then the value of user and expert, right? So will the PTCs of this world put so much intelligence in the CAD systems that anybody can become a designer, and the software sort of just guides you and that's it? And will then the engineers become the ones who design the software? Like we have now technicians to build, design, maintain copy machines. But we don't have typists anymore. And then the last big thing, and I think that is a huge issue that's not at all clear how it's going to work, is who owns what, right? And what we've seen in the music industry might very well happen in the physical world once the design model's out there and can be copied and everybody can print them out. Right? So I don't think there's an answer at this point, but that will drive a lot of how the business model will look like. And I think, as Amy talked about P&G, you see in many crowdsourcing sites that the companies who run the contest very quickly require to own the IP. Right? And what that will do to how people think about whether it's really still social or am I now providing free labor when someone else gains the benefit remains to be seen. Thank you very much.